Hello, my name is Keely Marlowe, and today I am talking about New Zealand agriculture for my project. So, for this first slide, what I have to show is for population based on New Zealand, really based on in 2023 right now. So, on the right side, you can see that in New Zealand, the population is just a little bit over 5 million people in the world. And that has been a slow increase from the past, probably the past 50, 60 years. And then it also shows on the right side the future outlook. And you can see at the very top, it looks like there's going to be a slight decrease of population in the future. And then on the left side, you can see that there is the population pyramid, which is just really showing you that right now there's a lot of people in their 30s and 40s, which one day means there will be a lot of people that are elderly, which means that there's going to be a lot less kids. The stars that you can see from the left and the right side for male and female, it's really the same age, but it just shows you again what I mentioned before, that there is a really large peak of the population in that age group, and under it there's really quite a significantly larger or smaller age group that will be older as well. But that just really shows you that the population is going to decrease in the future. And one of the main reasons that I noticed when I was doing my research is that this is based on migration. Increased migration really in 2016 before COVID hit, and still after COVID, has really increased, and it's been mainly from New Zealand to Australia, which makes sense since it is really close, but there's just been such a large migration rather than immigration that's why you see the population decreasing. So for this next slide, I spend a little bit of time talking about soils. And for these soils in New Zealand, you're able to see that the soil is really deeply weathered and it's lacking in nutrition and nutrients that are really important to be able to grow crops for animals in agriculture and humans. So one of the other things that I was able to see is that there's a variable even over short distances. So if you're looking at grass that's 10 inches tall in one place, you can go about 20 feet away and it's going to be at least 5 inches shorter or inches taller. It's just really variable over that land mass. The next thing that is really important is that there's a lot of sedimentary rock formation, which is really difficult to work with plants. But another thing based on the sedimentary rock is that there's a lot of clay around 3/4 of the country, which we see that a lot in North Carolina as well. But clay is just not the best environment for growing crops. And then in the last part, it's really been significant that there are large pockets of fertile soil around river terraces, which would make sense since there is the water there, but the river terraces aren't as abundant, so it makes things a little bit more difficult. But this map just really shows you kind of where New Zealand is compared to the world around us. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is resources. So in New Zealand, there are a bunch of different resources. This includes large coal reserves, and which I was able to find out that in 2016, there was about 4 million tons of minerals found in these coal reserves. And that leads to, now in 2023, having 15 operating coal mines, which is quite a large number in my opinion. The next thing I have is that 1.3 million acres of arable land has been found in New Zealand, but that was based on 2020. The next thing is also based on 2020. It is that there are 5.9 thousand kilograms of gold that are produced in New Zealand, which is another really important thing to us. So being able to have arable land to grow crops as well as gold just kind of makes the market a little bit higher for you. And then one of the other things I was able to find is that the main seafood exports were mussels, rock lobster, hoki, squid, and salmon, exporting about 90% of its seafood to foreign countries, which that's a lot of seafood that they're exporting rather than using themselves. And this pie chart just kind of shows you the different destinations and countries that New Zealand is actually exporting to. And you can see that the US is at 9.9% of that. So the next thing I have to speak about is the role of agriculture in New Zealand. And when I kind of thought about this, first of all, it was hard to find the way I wanted to go with this topic, but it was really important to me to talk about the history of farming, which is, I think, the whole point of where New Zealand is and originated from. So the first thing I saw was that European settlers began farming not long after arriving in New Zealand, actually. And I'll speak about that later on at the end of the presentation. But one of the first things in New Zealand that really happened was wool with sheep. Sheep are still very large in New Zealand, but wool was the first commodity that was really just taken upon, and really they ran with that. Following that, it was refrigerated meat exports, which happened in 1882 when the first refrigerated meat was exported through Britain. That ended up being followed by dairying, which really came from butter and cheese factories. That was where the significance of that was. And in the 1950s and 60s, I thought it was really interesting because livestock fertility increase was a focus during that period, which is it's kind of a big thing for us. I mean, if we didn't have fertility increasing, then we wouldn't be able to keep these animals going and keeping the demand satisfied for humans. And the final thing that has been really recently is that fruits and wines have been found to be really important. So that's really a horticulture standpoint that is something you wouldn't look at most of the time, but has become increasingly important in New Zealand. So the next thing that I talk about is regenerative agriculture, which is pretty large in New Zealand now. And regenerative agriculture is really, for a lot of people, it does no harm really, which is really important for us. And because it improves the land, it uses technologies that regenerate and revitalize the soil and in the environment. And it's said to lead to healthy soil as well as capable of producing high quality, nutrient dense food, and simultaneously improving rather than degrading land, and ultimately leading to productive farms and healthy communities and economies. So really the main things from regenerative agriculture is the five core principles that are talked about on here: minimizing soil disturbance, maximizing crop diversity, keeping the soil covered, maintaining living root year round, and as well as integrating livestock. So the next thing that I am speaking about is commodities and the impact it has on New Zealand's economy, which is really the foundation for this entire project. So the first thing I was able to point out was exporting agricultural commodities, and the main ones that are being exported are dairy products, as well as meat and forest products, fruits, vegetables, as well as wine. The nation is actually the largest exporter of whole milk powder, and that's 95% of milk produced, which is exported. And more of the products with that include butter, cheese, skim milk powder, and infant formula, which I think is really interesting that New Zealand will export the infant formula, which is really used everywhere now. And then another thing for exporting agriculture commodities is red meat is the second most exported commodity. And a major part of that red meat is coming from sheep as well as beef meat. And then finally, for this part, agriculture, fisheries, and forestries, they make up $12.653 billion of the gross domestic product in 2020, which was not that long ago. And it also employed 143,000 people and was about 5.9% of New Zealand's workforce, which is quite a large number for agriculture and a fishery standpoint. And on the right, you can just see those top 7 commodities that I spoke of in this slide. So following that, I spoke about production in New Zealand. And these are a lot of numbers that I'm kind of talking about today. So on the left side, you can see that there are 26 million sheep as of 2023. So that is a 5.1 sheep to 1 person ratio, which is kind of crazy. Following that, the 5.91 million dairy cattle, which leads to a 1.13 dairy cow per 1 person, which is also still a lot. And then following that is the 4 million beef cattle, which is a 1 dairy cattle to 1.3 people. And on the right side, just to kind of look at the more food standpoint, or rather than livestock production, more of a horticulture and that standpoint. So there are about 11.65 thousand trays of kiwis harvested each year, and that's at $2.45 per kilogram of kiwi. The next part is 553,000 tons of apples harvested, which is at $4.39 per kilogram. And then the potatoes are 3 billion potatoes grown each year at $2.51 per kilogram. And then finally, the 87 million gallons of wine produced each year, which is pretty significant, and that is at $3.09 per kilogram for grapes rather than the wine. So next, I'm going to talk about the leading industries. The leading industries, obviously it's agriculture, which is the most important in this, but that is also followed by construction as well as tourism. For the first part, which is agriculture, this is worth $5 billion of the industries and just any kind of economic standpoint for New Zealand. It has permanent as well as seasonal jobs, which is really interesting to think that all of these could have seasonal jobs. I actually found one website that talked about jobs you could have as a backpacker if you were just going to be dropping in and out of New Zealand or anywhere. The next industry is construction, which is $18.6 billion of the gross domestic product contribution, and that's 182,000 people that can be employed in this industry, as well as tourism, which is another astonishing amount of people. It's 225,000 people employed, $16.4 billion of the direct GDP, but it also leads to $11.2 million to industries supporting tourism, which is just crazy because it's not even directly in tourism, it's just the fact that they're supporting it. So some of the things I was going to also focus on is challenges in agriculture. And the challenges in agriculture that I'm going to talk about mainly is rising farm working expenses, as well as a lack of labor access, as well as climate change. So obviously a lack of labor access has kind of occurred more after COVID. Rising farm working expenses is also a COVID thing, but climate change, this just kind of shows that climate change is really a pretty bad thing. Hawke's Bay is one of the wine regions that are really important to New Zealand, and that's one of the places that they're really trying to decrease their carbon footprint. And one of the articles I found was for Agribusiness and Trade, and I thought this was really important. It said, yet the industry is in good shape. It's a great time to be food and fiber producer in New Zealand. So that just shows that people aren't giving up on the hope of agriculture still thriving. So next we have animal nutrition. This was just one thing I thought needed to be discussed, which was livestock animals are mainly fed on a grass-fed base because of the temperature and climate in New Zealand. The dairy cattle are grass-fed rather than grain-fed, which also aids to the richness in their milk. Beef cattle and sheep meat is higher in vitamins compared to grain beef. And then New Zealand imports more of their grain than it does exporting, just because it doesn't have much of that. It produces a lot of things and exports a lot, but it has to import grain more, so it's probably easier for them to just stick on a grass-fed diet. Really the final thing I wanted to talk about, which was really just kind of a funny thing that I really enjoyed learning about, was that the introduction of sheep to New Zealand was between 1773 and 1777, which is from James Cook, who was a British explorer. He was also credited for this, just being able to bring sheep, and I thought it was great because his birthday is actually the same as mine, November 7th. Obviously not 1728 because I was 2002, but the date is just really cool. And one of the final things that I thought was just really crazy was that once he released these sheep, he had a ewe and a ram that he released in Queen Charlotte Sound. And it was really funny because they only survived a few days after being released because they apparently ate poison plants, which was really a non-prosperous way to start the sheep industry. But they died pretty soon after being released. Just kind of a funny little tidbit I thought I'd share. And that was everything for my project. Thank you so much for listening.